My husband's family spent years calling me a gold digger behind polite smiles and passive-aggressive jokes. But the day my father-in-law's will was read, the same people suddenly realized they had made a very expensive mistake. My name is Susan Black. 8 years ago, I married Ryan Carter, and that's when I learned something about certain wealthy families. They don't always insult you directly. Sometimes they just smile and make sure you know you don't belong. Ryan and I live in Chicago now, but I grew up in Detroit. My parents were the kind of people who worked every day and didn't complain much about it. My dad believed if something was broken, you fixed it. My mom believed if you needed money, you worked more hours. That was basically the philosophy I grew up with. So when I met Ryan, I honestly didn't realize how different our worlds were. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Chicago. I was working as a reporter for a small local news station back then. I was trying to finish an article and the place was packed. Ryan asked if he could sit at my table since there were no other seats left. He looked normal. That's the funny part. No expensive watch. No flashy car keys on the table. Just a guy in a button-down shirt who seemed slightly nervous talking to a stranger. We started chatting. One coffee turned into 2 hours. He was funny in this quiet way. And he listened, which I wasn't used to. Most people talk over reporters because they assume we're only interested in their story. Ryan asked questions instead. About Detroit. About my job. About the weirdest story I'd ever covered. When I told him about a local city council corruption investigation, he actually seemed impressed. We started dating after that. For the first few months, everything felt normal. We went to regular restaurants, walked along the river, watched terrible movies on his couch. He told me he worked in finance, but he didn't make it sound like a big deal. The first time I realized something was different was when he invited me to meet his parents. Their house wasn't in Chicago. It was outside the city in a private neighborhood I had never even heard of. Huge homes. Iron gates. Security cameras. Ryan parked in front of a house that honestly looked more like a small hotel. Just ignore my family if they're weird, he said as we got out of the car. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. The front door opened before we even knocked. His mother, Helen Carter, was standing there waiting. She was perfectly dressed in a way that felt deliberate. Like she had prepared for my arrival. Ryan hugged her. Then he said, "Mom, this is Susan." She smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach someone's eyes. "Oh," she said. "You're the reporter." That was the first thing she ever said to me. Not hello. Not nice to meet you. Just that. Dinner that night was the moment I realized exactly what Ryan meant when he warned me his family might be weird. His father, Steve Carter, barely spoke at first. He just watched the room quietly. Ryan's older brother Mike Carter kept making these small jokes that didn't quite sound like jokes. At one point he raised his glass and said, to Ryan, finally settling down. Everyone laughed except Ryan. Then Mike looked at me and added, "You married well." The table went quiet for a second. Ryan immediately said, "Mike." But Mike shrugged like he had done nothing wrong. His sister Janet Carter leaned back in her chair and asked me, "So do you plan on keeping your little news job?" I remember blinking at her. "My little job?" She smiled sweetly. "You know, reporting." I said, "Yeah, I like my job." She laughed lightly and said, "That's cute." The whole dinner felt like walking through a room full of invisible traps. Every answer I gave seemed wrong somehow. If I talked about my work, they acted amused. If I stayed quiet, they treated me like I had nothing to say. But the strange part was Steve Carter, Ryan's father. He barely spoke during dinner. But when everyone else was arguing about something at the other end of the table, he looked at me and asked quietly, "What kind of reporting do you do?" "Local news," I said. "Mostly city politics." He nodded slowly. "That's real work." It was the first normal thing anyone in that house had said to me all night. After dinner, Ryan apologized in the car. "They're like that with everyone," he said. I didn't believe that. They weren't like that with everyone. They were like that with me. And it didn't stop. Family dinners. Holidays. Birthdays. Every time I saw them there would be some comment. Something subtle. Something that sounded polite if you repeated it out loud. "Ryan has always been generous. You're lucky Ryan found you. My son has a good heart." It was always framed like praise. But the message was obvious. They thought I married him for money. What made it worse was that I didn't even know how much money we were talking about until months later. Ryan finally explained the family business to me. His father started as a welder decades ago and eventually built a manufacturing company that grew into Carter Manufacturing Group. Factories. Distribution centers. Corporate offices. The headquarters were in Charlotte, North Carolina. Ryan worked as a banker, but the family still owned a huge part of the company. Once I understood that, the way his family treated me suddenly made more sense. They thought I had targeted Ryan. Like I had some master plan to marry into their money. The reality was much simpler. I loved Ryan. And I tried to ignore the rest. But there was one person in that family who never treated me like I didn't belong. Steve Carter. Over time I noticed something strange. Whenever the family had dinners, Steve would ask me questions. Not small talk. Real questions. What's the most difficult story you've covered? What happens when a source lies to you? How do you know when someone's hiding something? It felt less like conversation and more like he was studying how I thought. One night after dinner, while everyone else was arguing in the living room, he stopped me as I was leaving. "You see through people pretty well," he said. I laughed awkwardly. "Comes with the job." He nodded. "Most people in this house don't." Then he walked away. I didn't think much about that conversation at the time. But looking back now, that might have been the moment everything started changing. Because whether his family realized it or not, Steve Carter had already begun paying attention to me. And in that family, his opinion was the only one that truly mattered. I just didn't know yet how much that attention was going to cost everyone else. For the first year of my marriage, I tried to keep a simple rule in my head. Be polite. Keep your distance. Don't give Ryan's family anything they can twist against you. It wasn't hard to see how they operated. Every conversation felt like a test I didn't know I was taking. If I talked about work too much, I was trying to impress them. If I stayed quiet, I was uneducated. If I laughed at the wrong moment, someone would glance at someone else like they had just confirmed a theory. So eventually I stopped trying. I showed up to family dinners. I answered questions when asked. Then I left. Ryan noticed it. One night, after we got home from a dinner at his parents' house in Lakeview outside Chicago, he sighed and loosened his tie. "You barely talked tonight," he said. I shrugged. "Your sister asked if I planned to quit my job once you made partner at the bank." Ryan rubbed his forehead. "Janet doesn't think before she talks." "That's not the problem," I said. "The problem is she knows exactly what she's implying." Ryan didn't argue. He just looked tired. The truth was, Ryan loved his family. But he also knew they had a habit of closing ranks around anyone who wasn't one of them. And I was definitely not one of them. But the strange thing was, over time Steve Carter started pulling me into conversations that had nothing to do with family dinners. The first time it happened, it was almost accidental. Ryan and I had come over for dinner again. His brother Mike Carter was talking loudly about sales numbers from one of the company's factories. Apparently a facility in Buffalo, New York had missed its quarterly targets. Mike was frustrated and complaining about employees not working hard enough. I wasn't really part of the conversation, but I made the mistake of asking a question. What actually caused the slowdown? The room got quiet for a moment. Mike looked at me like I had just interrupted a meeting I didn't belong in. "It's complicated," he said. Steve Carter was sitting at the end of the table. He looked at Mike and said calmly, "Answer the question." Mike rolled his eyes. "Supply chain delays. Staffing issues. Same stuff every factory deals with." I asked, "Did you change anything after the delays started?" Mike frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, did management adjust schedules or suppliers, or did they just wait for things to fix themselves?" Janet laughed. "Wow, our reporter is solving manufacturing problems now." But Steve Carter didn't laugh. He leaned back in his chair and watched me. "What would you do?" he asked. I hesitated. "I mean, I don't run factories. But in reporting, if something stops moving forward, the first thing we do is figure out where the communication failed." Mike snorted. "This isn't journalism." "No," I said. "But if workers are waiting for parts and management isn't explaining delays, productivity drops. People stop caring." The table was quiet again. Steve nodded slowly. "That's not wrong." Mike looked irritated. But the conversation moved on. I thought that was the end of it. A week later, Steve called Ryan. Which was unusual, because Steve didn't really do casual phone calls. Ryan told me afterward what his father said. "Bring Susan with you next time you visit the office." I thought Ryan was joking. "Why?" Ryan shrugged. "He said he wants to talk to you about something." So the following Friday, Ryan and I drove to the Carter Company Chicago administrative office. It wasn't the main headquarters, that was still in Charlotte, North Carolina, but it handled regional operations. The building itself was surprisingly normal. No massive tower. Just a clean brick office building with the company name on the front. Inside, people clearly recognized Ryan. But when Steve Carter appeared in the lobby, the entire atmosphere changed. Employees straightened up immediately. Steve shook Ryan's hand, then turned to me. "Good to see you, Susan." He led us to a conference room. No ceremony. No assistants hovering around. Just a table, 3 chairs, and a window overlooking the parking lot. Steve sat down and folded his hands. "You asked a useful question at dinner last week," he said. I blinked. "About the factory?" He nodded. I checked the Buffalo situation. Turns out management didn't communicate with workers about the supply delays. I didn't know what to say. He continued calmly. Production improved after the issue was addressed. Ryan looked at me with raised eyebrows. Steve leaned forward slightly. People who notice problems without being defensive about them are rare. I laughed nervously. I was just asking a question. "Yes," he said. "That's the point." After that, something subtle changed. Steve started inviting Ryan and me to visit the office once in a while. Nothing official. Just conversations. Sometimes he'd ask my opinion about things. Not as a decision maker. More like someone testing how another brain processed information. One afternoon he asked, "What's the biggest mistake powerful people make when talking to reporters?" "That they assume reporters care about their image," I said. "And you don't?" "No. We care about what people are trying to hide." He nodded slowly. "You're honest." "I'm a reporter," I said. He smiled slightly. That might have been the first time I ever saw Steve Carter smile. Meanwhile, the rest of the Carter family noticed something. Steve was asking about me. And they didn't like it. At a holiday dinner that year, Janet leaned over and whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Dad's new consultant has arrived." Mike chuckled. "Careful, Janet. She might take your job next." I said nothing. Ryan looked annoyed, but he stayed quiet too. Steve was at the other end of the table. He didn't react. But later, when I was putting on my coat to leave, he walked past me in the hallway. "Don't worry about them," he said quietly. "I'm used to it," I replied. He stopped for a moment. "No," he said. "You shouldn't have to be." Then he walked away. At the time, I thought he was just being kind. I didn't realize he had already started forming an opinion about his own children. And about me. The truth is, families like the Carters are used to one thing above all else. Control. Control of their money. Control of their company. Control of who belongs and who doesn't. What none of them realized was that Steve Carter had started looking at that control very differently. And the more time he spent talking to me, the more he seemed to realize something about his own family. Something that was going to matter a lot later. Because whether anyone else noticed it or not, Steve Carter was quietly deciding who he trusted. About 2 years ago, things started changing. Not all at once. Just small things at first. Ryan told me one evening that his father had canceled a trip to Charlotte, North Carolina, where the company headquarters were. "That's weird," Ryan said while he was loosening his tie in the kitchen. "Dad never cancels meetings." "Maybe he's just tired," I said. Ryan shook his head. "My dad doesn't cancel things because he's tired." A few days later, we found out why. Steve Carter had cancer. Ryan told me after he got the call from his mother. I remember the way he stood in the living room holding his phone, staring at the wall like he was trying to process something that didn't make sense. "What kind?" I asked quietly. He swallowed. "Pancreatic." I didn't know much about it, but I knew enough to understand what that meant. The Carter family reacted exactly how you would expect a family like that to react. Suddenly everyone was involved. Mike started flying back and forth between factories. Janet began organizing schedules for hospital visits. Helen talked about treatment options and specialists in different states. But underneath all of it, there was something else. Fear. Steve Carter had always been the center of gravity for that family. The one person everyone listened to, even when they didn't like what he said. Without him, the balance of the entire family felt uncertain. Ryan and I started visiting Mercy Ridge Medical Center in Chicago every week. Hospitals always feel strange to me. Bright lights. Quiet hallways. People speaking in careful voices. The first time I walked into Steve's hospital room, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked smaller somehow. Still sharp-eyed, still alert, but the physical strength that used to fill the room had faded. Ryan hugged him. "How are you feeling?" Ryan asked. Steve gave a small shrug. "I've had worse days." That was typical Steve Carter humor. After Ryan stepped out to talk to a doctor, Steve looked at me. "You're still reporting?" he asked. I nodded. "City politics. Same chaos as always." "Good," he said. I sat down in the chair next to the bed. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he said something unexpected. "You know my children don't like you." I almost laughed. "That's not exactly a secret. They think you married Ryan for money." "I know." He studied my face carefully. "Why did you marry him?" The question was direct enough that I answered honestly. "Because he's kind," I said. "And because he's the only person in your family who doesn't treat people like assets." Steve watched me for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "That sounds like Ryan." After that visit, something changed in the way he talked to me. The conversations were less about work or the company and more about life. One afternoon, I brought him a book I thought he might like. It was about investigative journalism in the 1970s. "You read a lot about other people's mistakes," he said while flipping through the pages. "Occupational hazard." He smirked slightly. "Let me ask you something, Susan." "Sure." "When you interview someone powerful, how do you know if they're telling the truth?" I thought about it for a second. "You don't focus on what they say," I replied. "You watch what they avoid saying." He seemed to like that answer. Ryan visited with me most of the time, but occasionally I stopped by alone when I was already nearby covering a story. Those visits were quieter. Less about the family. More about random conversations. Once he asked me what I thought about loyalty. I said, "It depends on what someone is loyal to." He looked at me thoughtfully. "Most people are loyal to comfort." "What are you loyal to?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Results." Meanwhile, Outside the hospital room, the rest of the Carter family was starting to argue about things that hadn't even happened yet. I overheard Mike and Janet arguing in the hallway one afternoon. "If something happens to Dad, we need to talk about the company structure," Mike was saying. Janet crossed her arms. "You mean you need to talk about it?" Mike scoffed. "I'm the one actually running the sales division. And I'm the one who understands public relations," Janet snapped. Neither of them noticed I was sitting a few chairs away. It felt strange listening to them debate the future while their father was still down the hall. When Ryan came out of the room later, I told him what I heard. He sighed heavily. "They're already fighting about control. What about you?" I asked. Ryan shook his head. "I don't want the responsibility." That surprised me. "Really?" "I've seen what it does to people in our family," he said quietly. "Money doesn't make them better. It just makes them louder." Over the next couple of months, Steve's condition got worse. The visits became shorter. The conversations slower. But one afternoon, when Ryan stepped out to take a phone call, Steve looked at me and said something that stuck with me. "You know why I talk to you?" he asked. I shook my head. "Because you don't want anything from me." I felt uncomfortable hearing that. "Your kids don't want anything from you?" He gave a tired smile. "They want what I built." There was no bitterness in his voice. Just observation. Then he added quietly, "You're the only person in this family who talks to me like I'm still a man instead of an inheritance." I didn't know what to say to that. A few weeks later, Steve Carter passed away. The news traveled fast. Family members arrived from all over the country. The funeral was held at St. Mark's Chapel in Chicago, and it was enormous. Business partners, local politicians, employees from different Carter factories. People stood in long lines to shake Ryan's hand and offer condolences. Mike spent most of the service talking with executives. Janet coordinated things like it was a public event. Helen barely spoke at all. After the funeral, Ryan squeezed my hand quietly. "I feel like something big just ended," he said. I nodded. But standing there surrounded by people in black suits and quiet voices, I had a strange feeling that something else was just beginning. Because the Carter family was about to face the one moment none of them could control. The reading of Steve Carter's will. And none of us had any idea what was inside it. About a week after the funeral, Ryan told me his family had scheduled the will reading. "Do you need to come?" I asked. Ryan shrugged. "Mom said everyone should be there." So the following Tuesday afternoon, we drove to Nancy Reed's office in downtown Chicago. Nancy Reed had been the Carter family's banker for decades. The kind of person who handled serious financial matters quietly and efficiently. Her office building was modern glass and steel, overlooking the river. Inside, everything felt calm. Too calm. Ryan's mother, Helen Carter, was already seated at the conference table when we arrived. Her posture was perfect, but she looked exhausted. Mike Carter stood by the window scrolling through his phone. Janet Carter was whispering to her husband Tom Harris, who looked uncomfortable being there at all. Ryan and I took the last two empty chairs. No one said much. It felt like everyone was waiting for the same moment. Nancy Reed walked in a minute later carrying a folder. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and looked around the table. "Thank you all for coming," she said calmly. "As you know, we're here to review the final will of Steve Carter." She opened the folder. The first part was predictable. Steve had left several charitable donations. Some money went to employee funds for workers at Carter factories. The family house outside Chicago went to Helen Carter. Then Nancy began listing property distributions. Vacation properties. Investment accounts. Everything divided between Ryan, Mike, and Janet. Mike looked pleased. Janet looked relieved. Ryan just sat quietly. I barely paid attention to most of it. None of it involved me. Then Nancy paused. She looked down at the next page. "There is one final section regarding ownership of Carter Manufacturing Group." That got everyone's attention immediately. The company was the biggest asset Steve Carter owned. 40% of the company's shares were still in his name. Everyone in that room assumed those shares would be split between his 3 children. Nancy continued reading. "According to this document, Steve Carter has transferred his 40% ownership stake in Carter Manufacturing Group to," she looked up briefly, "Susan Black." For a moment, I thought I misheard. The room was completely silent. Then Mike Carter laughed. "Okay," he said. "Very funny." Nancy didn't laugh. She simply repeated it. "The 40% ownership stake in Carter Manufacturing Group has been transferred to Susan Black." I felt Ryan's hand tighten around mine under the table. Janet stared at me like I had suddenly become a stranger. "That's not possible," she said. Helen Carter leaned forward slowly. "Excuse me." Nancy slid the document across the table. "It's clearly stated in Mr. Carter's final will." Mike stood up. "This has to be some kind of mistake." "There is no mistake," Nancy said calmly. "The documentation was signed and verified several months ago." Janet looked directly at me. "What did you do?" The accusation in her voice was sharp. I blinked. "Nothing." Mike turned to Ryan. "You seriously expect us to believe this just happened?" Ryan looked stunned. I didn't know about this either. Nancy raised her hand slightly. There is an additional note from Steve Carter explaining the decision. The room went quiet again. Nancy read the note out loud. My children inherited comfort. Susan Black understands work. Carter Manufacturing needs someone who asks questions instead of protecting egos. That was it. Just 2 sentences. But they hit the room like a thunderclap. Mike slammed his hand on the table. This is ridiculous. Janet shook her head slowly. He was sick, she said. Someone clearly influenced him. Helen Carter looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was disbelief. You manipulated him, she said quietly. My chest tightened. I did not. Ryan finally spoke. Mom, stop. Mike turned to Nancy Reed. We're contesting this. Nancy didn't react. You're welcome to pursue legal options. But I should warn you, the documentation is extremely thorough. Mike looked furious. Ryan still hadn't let go of my hand. But when I glanced at him, I saw something complicated in his expression. Shock. Confusion. Maybe even worry. The meeting ended soon after that. No one wanted to sit in that room any longer. When we walked out of the building, Ryan and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment in silence. Cars passed. People walked by without realizing anything unusual had happened. Ryan finally looked at me. Did you know? No, I said honestly. He exhaled slowly. My family is going to lose their minds. He wasn't wrong. The phone calls started that night. Mike left a voicemail accusing me of manipulating his father. Janet sent Ryan a long message saying the will was obviously suspicious. Even a cousin asked Ryan if he planned to divorce me so the company shares would stay in the Carter family. Ryan ignored most of it. But the tension never really went away. Over the next year, something strange happened. I didn't try to take control of the company. At least not at first. But eventually the board asked me to attend meetings. Apparently owning 40% of a company makes people take your opinion seriously. What I found there was exactly what Steve Carter must have already known. The company had problems. Managers protecting their positions. Executives avoiding difficult decisions. Factories losing efficiency because no one wanted to admit mistakes. So I did the one thing I knew how to do. I asked questions. The same way I did when I was reporting. And slowly, things started improving. Production numbers climbed. Communication improved. Waste dropped. Meanwhile, the same people who spent years calling me a gold digger suddenly had to sit across from me in meetings. Mike had to explain sales reports to me. Janet had to justify marketing budgets. Every time I walked into the conference room, the resentment was obvious. But the company was doing better. And deep down, I think everyone knew something uncomfortable. Steve Carter hadn't made a mistake. He had made a decision. Ryan and I are still married. But his family barely speaks to me now. Sometimes I wonder if accepting those shares was the right thing to do. Because I didn't just inherit part of a company. I inherited the power his family always believed they controlled. And now I live with the strange reality that the people who once mocked me have to answer to me. I still think about the last thing Steve Carter ever said to me in the hospital. You're the only one here who talks to me like a person. Maybe that's why he trusted me. Or maybe he just wanted to remind his family that power doesn't always go where people expect it to. Either way, I never asked for revenge. But sometimes life hands you a moment where the truth speaks for itself. And now I'm left wondering something I still don't know the answer to. Did I honor Steve Carter's trust? Or did I quietly destroy the Carter family by accepting what he left me?